Welcome to our next discipleship class. So we are continuing along in the series on atheism. Basically, we are at the point of providing answers to the different criticisms from the atheist.org website, where they actually are giving what they believe are contradictions in the Bible with specific verses and how they contradict. So what we are doing is actually answering those contradictions. So we have come down to the place where they claim that this issue of temptation reveals a contradiction. So like it says here, let no man, this is from James 1:13, let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. Verse familiar to many Christians. And then in the Old Testament, in Genesis 22, it says, and it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham. So as we look into this, I think that it should be relatively straightforward what the answer will be. So first of all, the apparent problem here is that God does not tempt, as James says, but yet Genesis 22 says he tempted Abraham. So, in response, number one, God did not tempt Abraham or anyone to sin. Rather, he tested Abraham to see if he would sin or be faithful to him. God allows Satan to tempt us. We have some verses to reference there, but James is correct in saying, never does God himself tempt anyone. God cannot be tempted by sin since he is absolutely and unchangeably perfect. Again, a couple of reference verses for you. Nor can he tempt anyone to sin. So as we move on with the continuation of that answer, when we sin, human beings are tempted. When we sinful human beings are tempted, it is because we allow ourselves to be drawn away by our own lustful desires. Now that's what James explains in chapter 1, verses 14 and 15. That basically because there's something on the inside of us, this desire, this lust for things that are driven by our sin nature, that Satan goes fishing, or he sets a trap. And the word picture that James uses is there's a trap, there's bait in it, but the only reason I want the bait is because I have a desire. So if it's a sinful desire, then it's going to lead to sin if I act on it or if I take the bait and get trapped. So the source of temptation, though, as it says here, comes from within, not from without. It's from within my own nature. It comes from sinful man, not from a sinless God. So that is the source of the temptation. It is my own desires. That's what James is referring to. While God does not and cannot actually tempt anyone to sin, he can and does allow us to be tempted by Satan and our own lustful desires. Of course, his purpose in permitting, but not producing or promoting, important distinction, evil, is to make us more perfect. In other words, it is allow us to develop spiritually. God allowed Satan to tempt Job, so that Job would say, when he has tested me, I shall come forth as gold. We talked about Job in an earlier apparent contradiction. God allowed evil to befall Joseph at the hands of his brothers, but in the end, Joseph was able to say to them, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. Genesis 50:20. And again, this is an answer from when critics asked by Norman Geisler. So, additionally, the Hebrew word translated tempt in the King James Version that was quoted, it actually means to prove or to test or to train or to try or to give trial. And again, that is from the Complete Biblical Library Hebrew English Dictionary, which is pretty extensive. So hopefully that helps us. The next challenge is to family relationships. So they quote the verse in Exodus 20, verse 12, where it says, honor your father and your mother, which is the first time the Ten Commandments is listed. The second time is in Deuteronomy chapter 5. And then they go forward into the New Testament in Luke 14:26. If any man come to me and hate not his father and his mother and his wife, children, brethren, sisters, yea, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. Interesting verse. Now, the apparent problem here is that Jesus appears to be instructing people to disrespect their parents, to hate them, right? Does it actually mean that? Response. The command to honor parents is also repeated in Ephesians 6:2, where Paul writes to the Ephesians, thus a clear and repeated teaching in both the Old and New Testament. In Luke 14:26 and Matthew 10:37, Jesus is teaching on discipleship and what that means in love, loyalty, and devotion to him. His instruction in this light is not for the purpose of creating bitter hatred towards a father, mother, wife, children, brothers, or sisters, but he emphasized that love for him must be so supreme that all other loves are hatred by comparison. There should be an N on the end of compariso. No consideration of family ties must ever be allowed to deflect a disciple from Christ. So as we go forward, in Romans 9:13, Paul quotes Malachi, and hopefully that's understood. In other words, what Jesus is setting up is a contrast, obviously. He's not actually saying you need to hate people, but if someone were to look at my life, for example, I love my wife, but yet if God asked me to do something, then in obedience to what the Bible says, if for some reason my wife wanted me to do differently, it would look as though I had no respect for her. In other words, like, why aren't you doing what your wife asked? Well, because the Bible is asking me to do contrary to what she's asking me to do. Not that she would do that, but just as an example. So when I obey and I say, well, honey, I'm doing this because I'm being obedient to Christ, then to somebody else, that would look as though, well, don't you care about your wife? I mean, you're treating her as though you have no respect for her or you hate her. Well, in comparison, my loyalty to Christ should be such that any of the closest earthly relationships that I have, and the closest would be my own family, they would look like hatred in comparison. So I just want to make sure that that makes sense before we move on here. All right, so as we get to the next page, in Romans 9:13, Paul, and in the basic context of Romans 9, Paul is talking about how God elected a nation to bring his word and his Savior to the world through that nation. Anyways, in Romans 9:13, Paul quotes Malachi chapter 1, verse 2, and says, Jacob I loved, but Esau I have hated. Are we to understand that God loved one twin and hated the other? No. Again, the context clarifies any confusion. By the time the quote was made in Malachi, around 400 BC, both children had grown into nations. God, speaking through the prophet Malachi, told Israel he loved them, and they responded, in what way? The answer was the verse quoted. In other words, Jacob I loved and Esau I hated. God chose Jacob as the child who the messianic line would be through, not Esau. As they grew into nations, the Edomites, which was Esau's offspring, persecuted the Jews, Jacob's offspring, and God judged them, meaning the Edomites, for it, and never allowed them to prosper and gain strength as a nation. Obviously, while at the same time protecting the Jews. So the privileges, protecting, and provision God gave Israel were characterized by love. The judgment on Edom was said to be hatred. The word love is used here of comparison and also of decision. It's an important distinction. God was expressing his love to a rebellious nation when he was talking about Israel through Malachi, and explaining how he did that by comparison to his treatment of Edom. Paul teaches the same issue regarding national privilege in Romans 9, not literal hatred for a child. So that's important, and I put this in here because so many times, Christians read that and they say, "Oh, well, see, God chose Jacob, and then he didn't choose Esau for salvation." It's not even dealing with that. That isn't even part of the context. The context is that God protected one nation, but did not give the same rights and privileges to another nation. He protected Israel, as rebellious and sinful as they were, because he was bringing the Messiah and the Word of God, ultimately the gospel in the New Testament, through that nation. So I think we need to understand that God was dealing with nations at that point, and it was his decision to provide the blessing and secure the protection of Israel, which was demonstrated and seen in his love and care for them. At the same time, he did not afford that to the Edomites who persecuted Israel. And we get that through the minor prophets, especially Amos, how he explains that God judged them because of their treatment of Israel, as well as some of the other minor prophets. But anyways, so as we move on, the next issue on the website deals with the resurrection of the dead. Job said, "He that goeth down to the grave shall come up no more," Job 7. And then Jesus said, "The hour is coming in which all that are in the graves shall hear his voice and shall come forth." Now, the issue at hand is, does Job 7:9 contradict the Bible's teaching about resurrection? Now, obviously it doesn't, because even later on, Job said, "I believe in my flesh, I'm going to stand before God." So Job was actually claiming that he believed in the resurrection. But be that as it may, we'll answer it. The response: Job himself expressed belief in the resurrection, declaring, "After my skin is destroyed, this I know, that in my flesh I shall see God." Job 19. What he meant when he spoke of someone going down to the grave is not coming up, and not coming up is explained in the very next verse. So if we go to chapter 7, verse 10, he says, "He shall never return to his house." In other words, those who die do not return to their mortal lives again. Indeed, the resurrection is to an immortal life, not to the same mortal life one had before. Now, when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, the widow of Nain's son, the girl that died, that was at the centurion's home, and Jairus's home, and these were not resurrections. These were, I guess you could call them resuscitations or whatever. They raised again to die. Now that doesn't contradict what Job is saying. The normal course when somebody dies is that they don't go back home. They do not continue in this life. Now, Jesus raised them from the dead, demonstrating that he was the Messiah, the Son of God. That's why it's called a miracle. It's not a normal, repetitive thing that we see every day. If it was, then anybody could do it, and there would be nothing special about the work that Jesus did to demonstrate his messiahship. However, what Job is saying, I think, is relatively clear. As we go on, in Job 14:12, Job 14:12 does not deny there will be any resurrection, but simply that there will be none until the heavens are no more. That is, until the end of the age. But that is precisely when the resurrection will take place, namely at the time of the end. In fact, the passage actually teaches resurrection, for Job simply spoke of being hidden in the grave by God until an appointed time when God would again remember him in the resurrection. So if we were to go to Job 14:12, we realize that that verse with verse 7, it's not denying a resurrection or anything else. It's just simply saying that there will be a time when it occurs. And again, that's from When Critics Ask. So the next one, the end of the world. A lot of verses for this. So I'll just read them to you very quickly, and then we'll move along. Verily means truly. So verily I say unto you, there be some standing here which shall not taste of death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Matthew 16, it's Jesus talking. Same in Luke 21. Verily I say to you, this generation shall not pass away till all be fulfilled. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. Romans 13. Paul, and that knowing the time, that now it is high time to awake out of sleep, for now our salvation is nearer than when we believed. The night is far spent, the day is at hand. Let us therefore cast off the works of darkness, and let us put on the armor of light. James 5:8, be ye also patient, or endure, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord draweth nigh. In other words, it can come at any time. Little children, from 1 John, it is the last time, and as you have heard that Antichrist shall come, even now are there many Antichrists, whereby we know that it is the last time. And then 1 Peter, so we're basically hitting everybody here, which is fine. But the end of all things is at hand. Be ye therefore sober and watch unto prayer. This is still quoting the website, and they say these words were written between 1800 and 1900 years ago. Obviously, at the time when whoever the author was wrote this on the atheist.org website. And were meant to warn and prepare the first Christians for the immediate end of the world. Some words are those supposedly straight out of the mouth of the Son of God. The world did not end 18 or 1900 years ago. All that generation passed away without any of the things foretold coming to pass. No amount of prayer brought it about, nor ever so much patience and belief and sober living. The world went on, as usual, indifferent to the spoutings of yet another batch of doomsday prophets with visions of messiahs dancing in their deluded brains. The world, by surviving, makes the above passages contradictions. All right. Well, we know how they view it anyways. Question is, did Jesus and the New Testament writers say that the end of the world would come in the first century? Because that is the assumption from the website. Response. Number one, we will examine each verse listed in the challenge on the previous slide and respond to them individually, then respond to the conclusion drawn above. All right. The first verse, verily I say to you, some will be standing here which shall not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Here is the answer. And I think When Critics Ask gave the best one, so I put it up. This is a question of when this was going to take place, not whether it would. Though there are a few perspectives as to what Jesus meant, a more plausible explanation is that this is a reference to the appearance of Christ in his glory on the Mount of Transfiguration, which begins the very next verse, chapter 17, verse 1. Here Christ does literally appear in a glorified form, and some of his apostles are there to witness the occasion, namely Peter, James, and John. This transfiguration experience, of course, was only a foretaste of the second coming when all believers will see him come in power and great glory. So when Jesus was on the Mount of Transfiguration, Peter actually references that in 2 Peter chapter 1. He said, we were there when we saw the excellent glory, and he said, you're my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him. So Peter testified to it. Interesting, in 2 Peter chapter 1, Peter said, but we actually have a more sure word of prophecy. In other words, I have something that's more sure of what I believe that I saw and heard. I believe I saw Jesus transformed into his glorified state, in the sense that he was transfigured. And then he also said he heard, the Father speak out of the clouds of heaven. So he said prophecy is a more sure word. And the reason that is because you can't change it. If you have something written years ago and then it comes to pass, that is more sure than actually what you're seeing in front of you, because we can certainly be deceived at times to what we see. It's almost impossible to be deceived unless you just ignore it, what's been written, and then when you watch its fulfillment in front of you. So now, obviously, this gets into other issues that we don't have time with right now, but I just want you to understand that, at least in this context, the best answer for it and the more natural answer is that Jesus was referring to his transfiguration, which came right after he said this. The next verse, "Verily I say to you, this generation shall not pass away till all be fulfilled. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my word shall not pass away." The answer, after Jesus gave the signs of his coming surrounding the time of the future 7-year tribulation period, which he's referring to, he made the above statement in Luke. First, generation, Greek word genera, can mean race. In this particular instance, Jesus' statement could mean that the Jewish race would not pass away until all things are fulfilled. Second, generation could also refer to a generation in its commonly understood sense of the people alive at the time indicated. In this case, generation would refer to the group of people who are alive when these things come to pass in the future. In other words, when the things that are being discussed happen, it's that generation that he's referring to, not the current generation, right? Now, we know in Matthew 24, when Jesus is talking about, he's really given us the context of the tribulation period. Excuse me. And, one of the things that verifies that is that in Matthew 24:15, he refers to the abomination of desolation, which he is talking about yet future, but yet he refers back to the book of Daniel and Daniel's prophecy, so that if you understand Daniel's prophecy, you'll understand what he's talking about. At the same time, he also mentions, I believe it's in 24:21, that this is going to be a time worse than any other time in human history. Now, you can only have one of those times. You can't have two times that are worst. You can only have one. And Jesus refers to this one time period, yet in the Old Testament, we have a number of prophecies regarding it. In the book of Joel, in chapter 2, I think it's verse 2, or chapter 3, verse 2, Jeremiah 30, verse 7, Daniel 12:1. As you look and you start combining these verses, you realize they're dealing with the same time, the 7-year tribulation period that Daniel talks about, that is yet future, even as Jesus referred to it in Matthew 24. So it could easily be the Jews will survive until that time, that race, or he could be talking about the generation that sees the signs of this event starting to take place, will also be the ones that he's referring to. So the next verse, knowing, this is Paul, the time, that is now, it is high time to awake out of sleep, for now is our salvation nearer than when we believed. The night is far spent, the day is at hand. Let us therefore cast off the works of darkness, and let us put on the armor of light. Now, Paul is obviously exhorting us to live properly in light of the fact that Jesus could come at any time. And Paul did not know, obviously, exactly when that was going to occur. The fact that Paul says our salvation is nearer than when we believed is an obvious fact. I mean, obviously, every day that goes by, you get closer. The more time moves along, the closer to the end when Jesus will return, set up his kingdom through the nation of Israel. The phrase "at hand" means come near, approach. Paul's admonition in light of the fact that Jesus will return at any time, a time unknown to the church. Therefore, believers should live in light of that return because it is at hand. It could happen at any time. What Paul was not saying is that Jesus' return was going to occur at that moment, and I think that's an important distinction. The next verse, be also patient, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord draws near, or draweth nigh, James 5:8. But the end of all things is at hand, be therefore sober and watch unto prayer. They're really dealing with the exact same thing, so we put them together, the answer. The phrase draweth nigh, at hand, New King James, and at hand is the same as the previous verse discussed from Romans 13. In other words, you're dealing with the same issue, same words. Both James and Peter's admonition is the same, exact same as Paul's. They even use the same Greek word. The end time scenario is beyond the scope of this presentation, but the overall scheme will be on the next slide. Again, what James and Peter are not saying is that Jesus' return was going to occur at that moment, and that's an important distinction. So here's an end time slide. This gives you kind of the overall map of what we're really talking about. Notice that, I don't know if you can see this arrow here, but right here we're talking about the 7-year tribulation period. This is what was foretold in the Old Testament by the prophets and everything else. So again, you can kind of snapshot this on your video. You can pause it or do whatever, and then take a look at it in more detail later on, especially for you Christians, so that you understand what the chronology of the end time scenario looks like. But that's the rapture of the church, just so we know what we're dealing with. Then the 7-year tribulation occurs, and then the second coming. That is the sequence that the Bible gives to us. And then finally the millennial reign, and we're on to the next question. The next verse, John says, little children, it is the last time, and as you have heard that Antichrist shall come, even now are there many Antichrists, whereby we know that it is the last time. 1 John 2. Answer. It is, and this is from A.T. Robertson. He is a Greek grammarian, classic work, great theologian. It's a multi-volume set, but he said, it is the last hour. He gives you the Greek word there in the phrase. This phrase, only here in the New Testament, it is anatheros here, in other words, no article, and marks the character of the hour. Certainly in 1 John 2:28, John makes it plain that the parousia, in other words, that means presence, Jesus returns, might come in the life of those then living, but it is not clear, and here he definitely asserts that it is a fact. In other words, the fact of his return, not the specific time. It was his hope beyond a doubt. We are left in doubt about this last hour, whether it covers a period, a series, or a final climax of all that is just at hand, right? So, again, there were many antichrists in the first century. The last time really defines from the first century on till now. We have a tendency to think of more in our own time frames, but because we are in the last time, the New Testament actually is the last time. The Bible gives us an indeterminate amount of time when Jesus gathers people out from around the world to bring them into the church. And I'm not talking about different denominations and all that. In the Bible, the New Testament teaches us that the church, the fact that you have Jews and Gentiles in one body, uniquely, as it is, was a mystery, which means that it was not prophesied in the Old Testament. It was prophesied that eventually Gentiles would come to the Jewish Messiah in the kingdom time. However, the issue is that the church, as a group that has no distinctions in it, that are just all equal because of their faith in Jesus Christ, called the body of Christ, that is something that was not prophesied but revealed in the New Testament. Now, as we go on, the phrase here does not refer to the end of the world, but to the period preceding a crisis in the advance of Christ's kingdom. And that's Vincent in his Vincent Word Studies. Again, classic grammarian. These guys are grammar experts, which is why I'm quoting them. The church always lives in expectation of Christ's return. From the time of the New Testament writings, it is defined as the last days or last time. No dates are ever given for the parousia or the second coming of Christ. Now, this was also the last quote on the website, basically saying that, and I read it to you before, there's no need to reread it to you. You can read it yourself. But in answer to that, the previous answers address the skepticism expressed in this paragraph. When properly understood, the Bible does not make date predictions of Jesus' return and the establishment of his kingdom. The nature of the times and status of the nation of Israel are the indicators. Jesus' return for his church and the establishing of his kingdom are separate events, but will be surrounding the 7-year tribulation period as the future, as you saw on that chart. Jesus wants his people ready for the world. Ready for the world will not be. This is expressed in multiple places. So that's actually a poor sentence structure. I apologize for that. The world that I believe it should be will be. But anyways, the world is going to have a change with the 7-year tribulation period before the Messianic kingdom begins. So, their conclusion is this. What is incredible about the Bible is not its divine authorship. It's that such a concoction of contradictory nonsense could be believed by anyone to have been written by an omniscient God. To do so, one would first have to not read the book, which is the practice of most Christians, or, if one does read it, dump in the trash can one's rational intelligence to become a fool for God. In other words, to be an atheist, one need only be able to laugh when such obvious nonsense is offered as being divine truth. So this is the conclusion of the article's author. Little biased, obviously, but we're biased the other way. So in response, having a bias against the Bible does not, by definition, make it wrong. The Bible should be evaluated on its own merits as a legitimate document of antiquity that is validated in its historicity. I've shown that the claims against it from the atheist.org website were verses removed from their context and no consideration for either context or reference to similar topics was attained. Now, look, I'm not expecting people that are criticizing the Bible to necessarily pick it up, learn the whole thing, understand the context, go, start delving into theology. I understand that. I want to be realistic here. Look, I'm not spending all my time, though I do read some atheists. I'm not studying atheism so that I can, really delve into the thought process of being an atheist. I know what it's like to be on the other side of the fence. I wasn't a Christian my whole life, not until I was 24. So, yeah, I understand both worlds. However, I guess I would ask, from an atheist perspective, at least that they would try to deal with the Bible fairly, as opposed to just in a mocking way. Look, it's easy for Christians to mock certain concepts of atheists because the atheists do not take the time to fairly represent the issues that are being dealt with. And vice versa. I mean, look, this is a two-way street. It's not just a one-way street. I understand that, and I don't mind defending the Bible. That's not an issue for me at all. And what they say is certainly not hurting my feelings or anything like that. I just want to make sure that we understand that we're all dealing with the same issue here. The issue is that we should at least fairly understand the other side in order to bring any criticisms against it. Now, in fairness, I have made criticisms against atheism to the dissatisfaction of certain atheists. I had one atheist try to correct me and tell me that there's a difference between not acknowledging that there's a God and saying there is no God and being a non-theist and some of the details of those points. And I understand that. I do. But, from the perspective that I was presenting in this particular presentation, those distinctions were not, I didn't feel, as important to make than just dealing with the general concept of people that don't believe in God as opposed to people that do, because I was responding to concepts from the atheist website as I quoted. I expect atheists to disagree with the claims that the Bible is the Word of God, since they don't believe He exists, obviously. However, the only rational way to examine claims against the Bible is to provide evidence, finding sentences with words that conflict to show evidence of error and contradiction falls short of that goal. I just think that's a little bit of a cheesy way to do it, okay? Both atheists and theists have the same evidence for examination regarding the Bible and its claims. It should be approached objectively. It is the only reasonable method for any analysis of evidence. The Bible is often criticized from its enemies, right? No surprise, but the criticism is really unwarranted. More often than not, the criticism is founded on bias and typical atheist slogan than genuine analysis. And again, it's a two-way street. I understand that, but I'm trying to deal with the perspective of defending the Bible. I've attempted to give legitimate answers to the criticisms listed on the atheist.org website. I tried to do it as fairly as I could. Conclusion. Atheists make the claim that belief in God is ridiculous, yet must attribute near supernatural results to the process of natural selection, bringing the lively immaterial aspects from dead matter. Without exaggeration, it is a natural selection of the gaps argument, at least I believe it is, since evidence is lacking, resulting in a just so story. I think, you can only bring natural selection so far. You just do not get the things that we have, my ability to even communicate in this video and everything, from dead matter. We're really expecting rocks to do some supernatural stuff here. Atheists say their lack of belief exonerates them from claims of a belief system or even a religious belief system. This is simply a redefining of terms and criteria for what constitutes a system of belief. If it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, sounds like a duck, right? So I understand that atheists do not necessarily feel that they have a belief system, that it's something they are believing or whatever, but in reality, they do have a system of belief. At least that's how I understand it. When you have a set of criteria people are adhering to, I don't know what else to call it, quite frankly. Pushing the burden of proof to theists assumes that atheism is the standard and acceptable belief and assumes what they try to prove. It is circular logic that requires a theistic worldview to make their case. Now, what I mean by that is that the assumption is from many atheists that this is just like being an atheist is natural, like that's the natural state, and that anything added to that, in other words, belief in God, and again, I'm talking about a theistic God, dealing with Christianity obviously is where I end up, but one single God, not pantheism, not multiple gods, not a lot of the nonsense of paganism, but I'm dealing with a theistic God, one that created the universe and is not part of it. He is beyond time, space, and matter, right? So in dealing with that, to make the assumption that that is an additional thing that must be adhered to and a requirement that is beyond the normal, I think it's the opposite, because when you look at the fact that we have the effect of the universe, you have to have a greater cause. And there's no amount of logic or reasoning or scientific investigation that is going to provide that for us. Obviously, when you have something as vast as the universe and us and everything else, trying to discover a cause from that, I mean, you're not going to find that by putting it under a microscope anyways. But assuming that there is no cause and that it just kind of got here, I think that would be an abnormal state, because that's not even naturally how we think. That's my point. I don't think that atheism is should be assumed to be the normal basis, and then beyond that, we then become stretched in our credulity, to be theists. Atheists still believe what they adhere to as a system of belief, otherwise they would believe nothing at all, right? And that they don't do. So they obviously have beliefs, right? So this next video clip by John Lennox, I think, really explains it well. I don't want to run out of time here, but I do want to let you see this clip. It's really good.
And in Massachusetts. So what we're talking about, ladies and gentlemen, is worldviews, belief systems, each of them. The one is naturalism and the other is theism. And it's just here that we encounter the first confusion. When I debated Princeton professor Peter Singer in Australia recently, he started by saying to us that his chief objection to religious belief was that people remained in the faith in which they'd been brought up. And of course, I was a prime example. So just to redress the balance, I asked him publicly about his parents. I said, Peter, were your parents atheists? And he said, yes, they were. So I said, you remained in the faith in which you were brought up then. Oh, but he said, it isn't a faith. Oh, I said, I was under the impression you believed it. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that little spat, and I got on very well with Peter Singer, you can watch the debate online, is very revealing, because it's consistent with the attitude of the new atheists to regard religious faith as faith, and therefore, by definition, believing where there is no evidence. But atheism isn't a faith. And of course, any philosopher could point out to them how trivial that is. It is very important to see that we are dealing with two belief systems. One believes that this universe is the ultimate reality, mass energy. The other believes that God is the ultimate reality. And the burning question is, what evidence is there for the veritas of either of them? The truth of either of them? And in particular, what way does science point?
I really do appreciate John Lennox. So as we go on, atheists have differing nuances within their beliefs. What else could you call it, right? Whether anti-theists are simply not affirming any God's existence, the issue still remains there's no belief in God, right? So the atheist.org website mixes between claims against gods, or specifically the God of Christianity. However, we have not in our analysis split hairs over the specific nuances of theistic beliefs. This is only a tactic to avoid the charge against atheism instead of answering the challenge of evidence that a theistic God does not exist. Rhetoric is not evidence in support of atheism, no matter what nuance of unbelief or unaffirmed or any mixture thereof. So I just wanted to be clear on that. Atheists make comparisons of animals and humans, calling their behavior altruistic. This is an order too tall for materialism. What do I mean? Watching the behavior of animals and humans to draw on similarity, then reading back into the animal world attributes and values such as self-sacrificing love, heroism, etc., assumes an immaterial moral standard that an atheistic worldview is void of. An atheistic worldview, if God doesn't exist, there is no absolute right and wrong. There is only opinion or desire. There is no, because there's nothing beyond people. So it's what people in particular individually want. Immaterial value judgments are not part of the animal kingdom or atheistic worldview. Reading them back into the animal world to claim their development requires a theistic worldview to make the argument against theism. You can't logically have it both ways. Atheists have worked hard and attempted to develop reasons for the existence of ethics, but it will never be more than opinion. Right and wrong, ethics, or morality require an objective, eternal referent to humanity. Otherwise, it is opinion. You can spin it, slice it, dice it, and puree the discussion, but you cannot get by the fact that without the existence of God and the imposing of moral attributes on humanity, they simply do not exist. I just don't know a way to do that, quite frankly. Atheists talk epistemologically, in other words, how we know what we know, but avoid the inevitable consequence of the ontological elephant in the room. Ontology is why something exists in the first place. The issue is not the fact that ethics can be understood, in other words, by atheists or anybody else, but why they exist in the first place. Natural selection of the gaps is an insufficient cause for the immaterial existence of any moral imperative. You just can't get that. Natural selection does not give you a moral imperative. It's not even possible. I mean, natural selection doesn't even create life. Never mind non-materialistic aspects of morality. The next video clip is taken from a debate between William Lane Craig and Peter Atkins. I want you to note in this short clip, Dr. Craig explains how science cannot test everything and all truth does not come from science, which many atheists rely on because they are materialists, right? There are many aspects of humanity that are beyond the material world which science cannot account for and are only possible in a theistic worldview. I can't really stress that enough. So let's hear. This is an older debate, but nonetheless it makes the point.
To take about the world.
Sure, that's possible.
Okay. But do you deny that science cannot account for everything?
Yes, I do deny that science
So what
can
can't it account for?
Well, had you brought that up in the debate, I had a number of examples that I was going to give. I think there are a good number of things that cannot be scientifically proven, but that we're all rational to accept. Let me list 5. Logical and mathematical truths cannot be proven by science. Science presupposes logic and math, so that to try to prove them by science would be arguing in a circle. Metaphysical truths, like there are other minds other than my own, or that the external world is real, or that the past was not created 5 minutes ago with an appearance of age, are rational beliefs that cannot be scientifically proven. Ethical beliefs about statements of value are not accessible by the scientific method. You can't show by science whether the Nazi scientists in the camps did anything evil as opposed to the scientists in Western democracies. Aesthetic judgments, number 4, cannot be accessed by the scientific method because the beautiful, like the good, cannot be scientifically proven. And finally, most remarkably, would be science itself. Science cannot be justified by the scientific method. Science is permeated with unprovable assumptions. For example, in the special theory of relativity, the whole theory hinges on the assumption that the speed of light is constant in a one-way direction between any 2 points A and B. But that strictly cannot be proven. We simply have to assume that in order to hold to the theory.
But you're missing the whole...
So put that in your pipe and smoke it.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
So we are, none of these...
So I think that kind of makes the case, at least what I'm trying to demonstrate or explain. Atheists have worked hard and attempted to develop reasons for the existence of ethics, but in their worldview, it can never be more than opinion. Atheists claim the Bible contradicts itself and put forth verses to make their case. However, removing verses from their context and assuming they say something they do not creates a pretext. We have examined each set of apparent conflicting verses and revealed with some measure of historical context the claims of conflict vanish. Any writing can be taken out of context and a straw man argument created with it. This is what was done through the verses in question from the atheist.org website. I believe that's what it was. Final note. This presentation was an attempt to answer the claims made on a website that seemed to particularly target Christianity. I don't mind having to defend the Bible or any aspect of my faith because they are both supported by evidence. Having said that, just because I can prove objective evidence for the Bible and philosophically practical evidence for God's existence or the best explanation for ultimate reality does not mean the evidence is what all atheists will accept. I understand that. But let's be clear, that does not make the evidence less factual or inadequate. People have a right to believe what they want. That's the logical outworking of man made in God's image, not the inevitable result of natural laws, wherever they came from, or random chemical reactions in my brain that have no purpose or intention based on an atheistic worldview, which is what they would have to be. I genuinely appreciate the atheists that posted on my channel, even though they were, for the most part, in staunch disagreement with me. But I appreciate the posts, I really do. The open exchange of ideas and opportunity to work through these important and I believe eternal issues cannot be underscored. If God indeed exists, the consequences of this reality puts all people in the place of being eternally accountable to God. For those Christians that have patiently viewed this presentation, it is my hope that you realize your faith is not resting on the tenuous ground of how you feel, but the facts of the case historically and empirically. God requires us to put our faith in Him through Jesus Christ, but He has given so much objective and clear evidence. Faith is the natural result, at least in my perspective, of an understanding of both the manuscript and archaeological evidence for the Bible. These are records of ancient history more voluminous than any other existing record of men and events that we hold as factual, though these other ancient records of famous people and events shamefully pale in any real comparison. We saw that represented from when we went through the manuscript discussion. When someone claiming to be the Son of God incarnated can predict their death, burial, and resurrection from the dead, And contemporary eyewitnesses, well aware of the claims, verify that resurrection to the point of giving their life declaring its truth. Both objective and subjective evidence is revealed. Remember, people die for lies they believe to be true, but no one dies for what they know to be a lie, no one that is in charge of their faculties anyway. Objectively, for a Jew, the New Testament events regarding Jesus of Nazareth would have to meticulously correlate with all applicable messianic prophecies of the recorded Old Testament claims for future generations to authenticate the arrival of this Messiah. Any deviation would render him as a fraud, no different than Theudas and Judas of Galilee, who Gamaliel references in Acts 5. Subjectively for a Jew, since they had no reason to invite persecution, excommunication, and rejection from their own people, it demands an overwhelming reason why so many claim to see and experience the risen Jesus of Nazareth from among the dead. Examining all possible motives and taking into consideration their claims, they willingly gave their lives before recanting their eyewitness testimony, which is a powerful evidence from history, one that I don't think that we should just ignore or pass over. Finally, a key to remember, if the body of Jesus Christ was recovered by any of his enemies, we're talking the Romans or the Jews, that evidence would be far more prevalent than the existing massive body of eyewitness evidence claiming they saw him after he rose from the dead. All the apostles died as martyrs, minus John. He died of old age. So what is the gospel that we are asked to believe? The word gospel means good news. Paul said to the Corinthians, "Moreover, brethren, I declare to you the gospel which I preached to you, which also you received, and in which you stand, by which also you are saved, if you hold fast that word which I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I delivered to you first of all that which I also received, that Christ died for our sins, according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day, according to the Scriptures, and that he was seen by Cephas, meaning Peter, and then by the 12. That's a designation for the original apostles. After that, he was seen by over 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain to this present." In other words, you can go ask them. "But some have fallen asleep," they had died. After that, he was seen by James, his half-brother, and the pastor of the Church of Jerusalem, and then by all the apostles, in other words, even the ones that were not the original 12, the others like Barnabas and them that traveled with them. Then last of all, he was seen by me also, as by one born out of due time. Paul came later. He was not one of the original apostles that walked with him and believed in him prior to the resurrection. That is his point. The gospel declares the deity, because when we get into the Bible, we realize the Messiah is both, he's the Son of God, God in human flesh. The deity, the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. Now, a lot of people think John 3:16 is the gospel. John 3:16 is the application of the gospel. The fact that Jesus is God, he had to be both God and man to touch God and man and be that bridge. Christianity is the only, if you want to call it a religion, that's fine. It's the only religion out of all the world religions where God reached down to man. All the other religions are man trying to reach up and touch God. You know, it's standing on the top of a high building or whatever, just trying to reach up and touch God. That is not what the Bible provides as the gospel message. The gospel message is that God loves us. He sent his Son, the Son of God, took on humanity so that he could die, be buried, and then he conquered death by raising up again from the dead and then ascended into heaven. Now, God has a plan, obviously, that he presents in the Bible, but that's why John 3:16, people think that's the gospel. but it's really the gospel applied. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him wouldn't perish, but have everlasting life. God didn't send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. So God's intention for us is good. A lot of times within an atheistic context, atheists believe that evil in the world demonstrates the fact that there is no God. On the contrary, the solution to the evil is Jesus Christ and God's plan. But there's no way to avoid evil in the world if God were to provide man that he created free will. That free will didn't make men evil, but it gave the potential for evil. No different than parents, the first time they give the keys of the car to their kids when they get their license. God forbid if a kid went out and got in a car accident, the parent didn't make them get in an accident, but the potential happened when they gave them the keys. So when God gave man free will, it created the potential for evil. Once that took place, and man started passing on that sinful nature to everybody, God didn't just leave us alone. He loved us, and he has a plan. So the plan is enacted in the gospel so that everybody on this planet is savable through faith in Jesus Christ. That is the only way to apply that gospel, that good news, all that Jesus accomplished for us. When we believe in him, what happens is God actually not only forgives us, but he transfers the only righteousness that can be in his presence, the righteousness seen through the resurrection of Christ. Jesus was absolutely righteous, sinful. He raised up. He conquered death. That was a demonstration of the fact that the Father accepted his sacrifice on the cross for us. Yes, he is our substitute. However, he's also God. So he raised up forever, and then people that believe in him, they get transferred his righteousness to their account. So I get that because of my faith in Christ, because I can't earn it. There's nothing I can do as a human being, a sinful person, to earn a place in heaven, a relationship with God and his eternal kingdom. I cannot do that on my own. I need God to do that for me. He did all the work. He asks us to believe. And I think he's given us plenty of evidence to do that. And hopefully, through this presentation, you've seen that. Now, this is recommended reading that I'll end with. I quoted from this a number of times when critics ask. General Bible Answers are in it. Also, the Big Book of Bible Difficulties is also something that you can get answers from that have a lot of similarities in it. In particular, this In Defense of the Resurrection by Norm Geisler, I think, gives some great information regarding the resurrection itself. Who Moved the Stone by Frank Morrison, again, specific answers about the resurrection. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. Again, this is previous presentations I did are based on this book, which is really based on the 12 points that prove Christianity is true. And Stealing from God by Frank Turek. This gives you apologetic answers for theism and the Christian faith contrary to science, from an evolutionary perspective, and materialism, and basically how atheists need to use God to make their case. They have to steal a Christian worldview in order to make their case against him. So that's the presentation. I know it went long. I apologize. I hope that it was of value to you. And until the next time that we meet, may God richly bless you as you continue to study his word.